The day started like any other for the passengers boarding the flight. Families, business people, and travelers of all kinds filed into the airport terminal, their faces a mix of excitement, fatigue, and anticipation. Some were chatting with their companions, others were absorbed in their phones or quietly observing the bustling crowd around them. Among them, there was an ordinary-looking flight attendant moving gracefully down the aisle, smiling politely at passengers as she helped them find their seats and stow their luggage. She appeared calm, friendly, and professional, the kind of person who could make even the most nervous traveler feel reassured. No one could have guessed that this ordinary flight attendant held a secret far beyond their imagination. A secret that could turn this ordinary flight into a story of survival and courage. The passengers settled in, buckling their seatbelts, adjusting their trays, and preparing for takeoff. Some were eager to read a book or watch a movie, while others simply stared out of the window at the endless stretch of runway and sky beyond. The plane hummed softly as the engines roared to life, and the flight attendant continued her work, her movements precise and calm. She checked on each passenger, offering a reassuring smile, a gentle word, or a helpful hand. She exuded an air of confidence that put everyone at ease. Yet her mind was alert, scanning everything with a sharp focus that only someone with military experience could possess. To the passengers, it seemed like a normal flight, a routine trip that would take them to their destination safely. The aircrew followed standard procedures, ensuring that all safety checks were complete and that everyone was comfortable. The flight attendant made small talk with nervous passengers, cracking light jokes to distract them from the nerves that always accompany a takeoff. Her voice was soft yet commanding, and there was a subtle intensity in her eyes that some passengers unconsciously noticed but could not place. She moved down the aisle with grace, helping passengers adjust their seatbelts and stowing luggage with efficiency that came naturally to her. Everything about her screamed professionalism, yet beneath that calm exterior, she was quietly preparing herself for a situation she had encountered in a very different, far more dangerous context: the battlefield. As the plane taxied down the runway, passengers felt the familiar push of acceleration, the roar of the engines filling the cabin. Some closed their eyes, bracing for takeoff, while others pressed their foreheads to the window, taking in the sight of the city shrinking below them. The flight attendant walked the aisle one last time, making sure everyone was comfortable and that the cabin was secure. To any casual observer, she was just another member of the crew, performing routine duties, nothing more. But every movement she made was deliberate. Every glance she cast toward the passengers and crew was filled with observation and assessment. Years of military training had taught her to notice the smallest details: body language, unusual behavior, tension in muscles, even the slight shift of a gaze, and she was quietly taking it all in, though no one suspected it. For most passengers, the flight was mundane, predictable, and unremarkable. They chatted quietly, read, or watched in-flight entertainment, oblivious to the storm that would soon descend upon them. But the flight attendant, hidden in plain sight, was fully aware of the unpredictable nature of human behavior. Her mind ran through countless scenarios, silently preparing herself for anything that could happen. She wasn't just a flight attendant. She was a trained combat pilot who had faced life-and-death situations before. The skills she had honed over years of military service were dormant now, waiting for the moment they would be needed. But she was ready. As the plane lifted into the sky, leaving the familiar ground behind, the ordinary flight experience began. But the air was thick with tension that only she could sense. She moved from row to row, subtly observing every passenger, noting anyone who seemed out of place or unusually anxious. To the rest of the passengers, it was simply the calm routine of a professional crew. But in her mind, she was running simulations, preparing mentally for any danger that could arise. The takeoff was smooth, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. Passengers relaxed slightly, feeling the sense of safety that comes from being in a controlled environment. Children giggled quietly as parents whispered reassurances. Couples leaned into each other, and travelers tried to enjoy the brief respite from the chaos of their daily lives. The flight attendant continued her rounds, her presence quietly commanding the cabin. She smiled, answered questions, and maintained an aura of calm authority that reassured everyone. But deep down, she was aware that calm skies could change in an instant, and she was ready for the storm that would test every skill she had ever learned. No one on the plane suspected that beneath the uniform, behind the friendly smile and polished appearance, the flight attendant was someone who had flown in high-risk missions, who had faced armed enemies in the sky, and who carried the marks of battles won. She was ordinary in appearance, but extraordinary in skill and courage, a secret waiting for the moment it would be revealed. This ordinary flight, on a seemingly ordinary day, was about to become the setting for an extraordinary display of heroism that no one would ever forget. And so, the flight continued, passengers unaware of the hidden guardian among them, moving calmly through the aisles, helping where needed, observing, and preparing. The ordinary journey had begun, but the first part of the story of courage and survival had quietly set the stage for the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. The calm of the flight didn't last long. Just as passengers were settling into the rhythm of the journey, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted abruptly. A group of men, who had been quietly moving toward the back of the plane, suddenly sprang into action. They were armed and ruthless, and their intentions were clear the moment they shouted, demanding control. Panic spread instantly through the cabin like wildfire. People screamed, clutching their belongings and pressing against their seats, while some froze, unsure whether to move or stay still. The ordinary flight had turned into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. The hijackers moved quickly, trying to assert authority with loud, threatening voices. They shouted orders, demanding passengers raise their hands, stay in their seats, and follow instructions without question. The passengers, terrified, obeyed, some trembling violently, others quietly crying. The cabin was filled with a chaotic mix of fear, confusion, and the low hum of the plane's engines. The hijackers' presence was dominating. Their eyes darted around the cabin, scanning for anyone who might resist, anyone who might interfere with their plans. Amid the chaos, the flight attendant maintained a calm exterior. To the passengers, she appeared composed and professional, moving through the aisle as if performing her usual duties. But in her mind, a storm of calculations and strategies was unfolding. She had been trained for situations far more dangerous than this: hostile territory, enemy combatants, high-risk missions, but she knew that every choice here had to be precise. One wrong move could put dozens of innocent lives at risk. Unlike the battlefield, where she could count on backup and controlled environments, here she was surrounded by unarmed civilians, with no immediate support besides the other flight crew. She watched the hijackers carefully, noting their positions, how they moved, and the weapons they carried. Every flick of their wrist, every glance, every subtle shift in posture gave her information. One of them, she noticed, was particularly agitated, gesturing violently and shouting louder than the others. Another seemed nervous, constantly glancing at the passengers, as if unsure of what to do next. To a normal observer, it was just random chaos, but she saw patterns, weaknesses, and openings. Her mind raced, analyzing every possibility for how she could turn the situation to her advantage without alerting the hijackers too soon. Passengers whispered to each other, trying to calm their loved ones, but fear was contagious. Children clung to their parents, crying silently or burying their faces in someone's shoulder. Adults whispered reassurances they didn't feel themselves. Some passengers tried to appear calm, hoping the hijackers wouldn't notice them. Every small action was amplified in the tense, confined space of the plane. The flight attendant used this tension to her advantage. She moved slowly, carefully, speaking in calm, soothing tones to passengers near her. "Everything will be fine," she said quietly, though her words were not empty. Her voice was designed to keep panic from spreading further, to prevent anyone from making sudden moves that could provoke the hijackers. She subtly guided nervous passengers into positions that would make them safer if the situation escalated. Meanwhile, the hijackers were demanding access to the cockpit. The main pilot tried to remain calm over the intercom, explaining that the cockpit was secure, but the hijackers were impatient. They threatened violence, making it clear they would stop at nothing to achieve their goal. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Passengers could feel the stakes, the invisible line between life and death, and the desperation in the hijackers' eyes. Despite the fear and chaos, the flight attendant did not hesitate. Years of combat experience had trained her to stay calm under pressure, to see clearly in situations where others might panic. She assessed the hijackers' movements, predicted their next steps, and mentally mapped out how she could neutralize them. She was also thinking about the passengers, how to protect them, keep them calm, and minimize the risk of injury. Each second mattered, and she understood that hesitation could be deadly. One hijacker approached a young family, yelling aggressively and waving his weapon. Parents shielded their children, and the flight attendant saw the opportunity. Without drawing attention to herself, she positioned herself between the hijacker and the family, using her body language and voice to distract and defuse the immediate threat. She feigned nervousness, subtly buying time while scanning for the next possible move. Her actions were precise and deliberate, a blend of calm performance and tactical assessment. By now, the cabin was tense beyond measure. Everyone was alert, fearful, and on edge, yet no one could anticipate what the flight attendant would do next. To the passengers, she was simply doing her job, but she was also the silent guardian, calculating every risk, planning every move, and waiting for the right moment to act. She knew that brute force would not work. She needed strategy, patience, and timing. The hijackers continued their attempts to dominate the plane, barking orders and threatening violence, unaware that the flight attendant was not ordinary at all. She had survived situations that would terrify even the bravest soldiers, and she knew she could turn the tide if she waited for the perfect moment. For now, she remained calm, observing, protecting, and preparing. The passengers clung to hope, not knowing that the person they trusted most in the cabin was already planning the extraordinary heroism that would soon unfold. The flight, which had started as an ordinary journey, had become a tense, life-threatening ordeal. Fear was everywhere, but so was a quiet, unseen force, a flight attendant with the heart, skill, and courage of a combat pilot, ready to change the outcome of this terrifying hijacking. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the first moves of an extraordinary story of bravery were quietly beginning. While the hijackers tried to dominate the cabin, one person remained unusually calm, the flight attendant. To the passengers, she still appeared composed, professional, and in control. She moved through the aisles, speaking softly to frightened passengers, offering reassurance while making subtle adjustments to keep everyone safe. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm of training, skill, and experience was quietly coming alive. Unlike the passengers, she knew exactly how dangerous the situation could become. She had been in life-and-death scenarios before, situations that required split-second decisions and precise execution. The chaos in the cabin was serious, but for her, it was a situation she could handle. In another life, she had been a combat pilot, flying high-stakes missions in hostile territories. She had faced enemies who wanted to kill her, missions where one mistake could mean the end. She had endured countless hours of stress, fatigue, and danger, returning home only with her training, her skills, and a mental record of her victories. Those victories were not just trophies, they were life-saving actions that had earned her the respect of her comrades and the fear of her enemies. The marks of her experience, often called kill marks, represented confirmed targets she had neutralized during her missions. Most people had no idea what those marks meant, and even fewer would imagine that a seemingly ordinary flight attendant carried that same deadly expertise onto a commercial airliner. As the hijackers moved closer to their objective, the cockpit, her instincts kicked in. She was not just observing. She was analyzing, planning, and preparing. Her eyes scanned the cabin, noting the weapons the hijackers carried, the way they moved, and the positions of the passengers. She watched the way one hijacker fidgeted nervously with his weapon, while another barked orders aggressively but lacked coordination. These small details told her where she could act and where she needed patience. She understood that her past experience had trained her to spot weaknesses, but it had also taught her the importance of timing. Acting too early could provoke violence, while acting too late could put lives in danger. Every move she made was carefully calculated. She positioned herself strategically, subtly guiding passengers to safer spots without drawing attention to her actions. She whispered quiet instructions to those nearby. Stay low, don't make sudden moves. Her voice was calm, steady, and reassuring, preventing panic from spreading further. Passengers thought she was simply doing her job as a flight attendant, but in reality, she was controlling the cabin environment, keeping potential hazards at bay, and preparing for the moment she would need to strike. Her mind ran through every possible scenario, running simulations the way she once did before airborne missions. She considered what would happen if a hijacker approached the cockpit, if a weapon was raised, or if a passenger panicked and drew attention. Each possibility had a solution, each risk had a countermeasure, and each second counted. She mentally rehearsed her next moves, ready to act with the precision of a trained soldier. Unlike her passengers, who were terrified and overwhelmed, she was calm, focused, and fully aware of her surroundings. Despite the fear and tension in the cabin, she also observed the passengers with care. She noted the children clinging to their parents, the elderly trying to stay calm, and those who were quietly shaking in fear. Protecting them became as important as neutralizing the hijackers. She used her experience to predict how the hijackers might react to sudden movements, carefully ensuring that any actions she took would not provoke immediate danger. She understood that lives depended not only on her skill but also on her ability to remain invisible, to appear ordinary while preparing extraordinary actions. For a moment, she allowed herself to assess the entire situation from a distance, almost as if watching it unfold on a tactical map. She could see the hijackers' weaknesses, the positions of the passengers, and the paths she could use to intervene. Her military background had trained her for battlefield improvisation, and this hijacking, though different from a combat mission, required the same skills: observation, patience, planning, and precision. She had faced enemies before who were heavily armed and dangerous, and she had survived. Now, she would need every ounce of that experience to protect dozens of innocent civilians in a confined, high-stress environment. The flight attendant knew that brute force alone would not win this battle. The hijackers were armed, and any direct confrontation without strategy could have disastrous consequences. Instead, she relied on her training to outthink them, to anticipate their actions, and to prepare for the exact moment when she could take control. She understood that courage alone was not enough. Skill, planning, and timing were everything. The passengers were unaware that the calm, professional woman among them was a decorated combat pilot, one who had faced enemies with far more firepower and survived. Even as she moved through the cabin, her mind was alert to every sound: the rustle of a bag, the shuffle of a foot, the whisper of a command. She listened for cues from the hijackers, reading their intentions as clearly as she could. Her combat experience allowed her to process this information quickly, predicting the next step and preparing accordingly. Every second was precious, and she used them all. Passengers, meanwhile, were drawn to her calm demeanor, thinking she was simply doing her job as a professional flight attendant. They did not know that behind her polite smile and composed movements was a woman ready to risk everything, someone whose extraordinary skill could decide the fate of everyone on board. The ordinary flight had become a high-stakes situation, and she was quietly preparing to turn the tide. In that moment, the flight attendant's true identity as a skilled combat pilot began to emerge, not through action yet, but through awareness, control, and quiet authority. She had become the hidden force that could change everything, the silent guardian whose expertise would soon make the difference between life and death for everyone in the cabin. The cabin was tense, every passenger frozen in fear, every hijacker moving with a mix of aggression and impatience. The flight attendant, still appearing calm and professional, knew that she couldn't rely on panic or luck. She had to act, but first, she needed to understand everything: the numbers of hijackers, their positions, their weapons, and their patterns. Her mind, trained for high-stakes combat situations, immediately went into full assessment mode. She scanned the cabin carefully, noting every detail that could help her make the right decisions. She noticed that one hijacker was more impulsive than the others, constantly gesturing with his weapon and shouting orders, while another seemed nervous, glancing at the passengers as if unsure how to maintain control. These observations were critical. Her experience in the military had taught her to spot weaknesses, even in the most dangerous enemies. She realized that she could use these behavioral patterns to her advantage. The aggressive hijacker could be baited or distracted, and the nervous one might be persuaded or immobilized with a clever move. Every small detail mattered, and she took it all in silently. The flight attendant also took note of the passengers' positions. Families with small children were huddled together. Elderly passengers clutched the armrests of their seats, and some adults tried to shield the more vulnerable. She quickly assessed which passengers could move if necessary, which could remain seated safely, and who might require immediate assistance if a struggle broke out. Protecting the passengers became her first priority. Without their safety, no plan would succeed. She subtly repositioned herself to stay close to the most vulnerable while maintaining a line of sight to the hijackers. Her mind moved at lightning speed. She ran through every possible scenario. What if one hijacker rushed toward the cockpit? What if they decided to harm a passenger? What if someone panicked and accidentally triggered a confrontation? She visualized each possibility, mentally preparing multiple strategies for how to respond. Her past as a combat pilot had trained her for these moments. On the battlefield, she had to make instant decisions with no margin for error. Now, she applied the same principles in a completely different environment. The confined, unpredictable world of a commercial airplane cabin. She also had to consider timing carefully. Acting too soon could provoke violence before she was ready, but waiting too long could allow the hijackers to gain further control of the plane. Patience, observation, and precision were her allies. She knew she had to strike at the exact moment when the hijackers were most vulnerable, when their guard was down, and when her actions would have the greatest effect. Every second of waiting was not wasted. It was preparation. While analyzing the situation, she began subtly signaling passengers to follow her instructions without alerting the hijackers. A slight nod here, a whisper there. She guided people to safer positions, instructing them to stay low, keep calm, and avoid sudden movements. She moved among them carefully, her presence reassuring. Even though no one knew it, she was already taking control of the cabin without drawing attention, creating a calm pocket in the storm of fear. Her attention returned to the hijackers. She watched how they communicated with each other, how they shifted their weight, and how they reacted to passenger movements. Each twitch, glance, or raised voice was data that she could use. One hijacker held his weapon loosely, seeming overconfident and unaware of the risk of a sudden counterattack. Another hesitated before shouting an order, showing uncertainty. These subtle cues told her where she could intervene and how. She understood that, in a dangerous situation, perception was everything. If she could control what the hijackers perceived, she could control their actions. At the same time, she continued to maintain her cover. To the passengers, she was calm and professional, doing her job as a flight attendant. To the hijackers, she appeared compliant and unassuming, not drawing suspicion. This dual perception was critical. She needed the hijackers to underestimate her, to believe she was just an ordinary member of the crew. Meanwhile, she prepared mentally for the actions that would soon follow. Her body was tense but controlled, her senses alert, every nerve ready to respond. As she moved through the cabin, she also considered improvised tools and tactics. A folded tray, a magazine, even a tightly held belt could become a defensive tool if needed. Her military training had taught her to use her environment creatively in life-threatening situations. She noted the positions of the nearest passengers, the location of emergency equipment, and the reach of the hijackers' weapons. Every detail could be used in her favor. Finally, after fully assessing the situation, she began formulating a precise plan. It was a combination of distraction, strategy, and timing. She knew she could not rely on sheer strength or surprise alone. Instead, she would use her observation, her knowledge of human behavior, and her combat experience to regain control. She silently promised herself that she would protect the passengers at all costs. Her calm demeanor, careful positioning, and careful planning were all building toward a single moment, one that could save lives and prevent tragedy. The ordinary flight that had started just hours ago had transformed into a high-stakes situation where fear and courage coexisted. The passengers were still unaware that a hero among them had already begun quietly taking control. The flight attendant, a decorated combat pilot in disguise, was preparing to act. She had analyzed the hijackers, assessed the passengers, and formulated her plan. Everything was in place. The next move would decide the fate of everyone on board, and she was ready. The flight attendant knew that observation and planning alone would not be enough to save the passengers. The hijackers were unpredictable, and their anger and impatience were growing with every passing second. She realized that to gain control, she would need to act carefully, creating distractions while positioning herself for the right moment. Acting too aggressively could provoke immediate violence, but doing nothing could allow the hijackers to take the plane completely. Her mind, trained in combat and high-pressure missions, was now calculating every possible move, searching for the perfect way to intervene without endangering the passengers. She began subtly creating small distractions. She moved down the aisle, speaking softly to passengers, reassuring them, and quietly guiding them to safer positions. A gentle nod here, a whispered instruction there, kept people calm and ready without alerting the hijackers. She had learned long ago that small actions could have a huge effect in tense situations. Each word, each movement was deliberate and measured. She was building a calm layer within the chaos, making the passengers less likely to panic and more likely to follow instructions if a larger emergency unfolded. At the same time, she started engaging the hijackers indirectly. She asked simple questions in a nervous but compliant tone, keeping them talking while subtly reading their intentions. One of the hijackers, already overconfident, began boasting about his control over the plane, waving his weapon in the air to intimidate the passengers. Another was anxious, shifting from one foot to the other, glancing at the passengers and muttering under his breath. By keeping them talking and slightly distracted, she bought precious time to plan her next move. Every second she gained could make the difference between life and death. She also observed how the passengers reacted to the hijackers' aggression. Some were frozen with fear, others were trying to comfort children or family members. A few brave passengers made small movements, trying not to provoke the hijackers but also not fully complying. She noted all these positions carefully, knowing that every passenger's safety depended on how she coordinated the next steps. The cabin was a delicate balance, and one misstep could trigger disaster. With each moment, she prepared for the inevitable confrontation. She mentally rehearsed the actions she might take: disarming a hijacker, shielding a passenger, moving in for a quick strike, or using nearby objects as tools or barriers. Every plan was precise and every contingency was considered. She had done similar calculations thousands of times in her military missions, and though this was a different environment, the principle was the same. Analyze, predict, and act with precision. At a calculated moment, she made a subtle move that drew the attention of one hijacker. Pretending to adjust a passenger's bag, she stepped slightly in a way that blocked his line of sight, forcing him to turn and focus on her instead. Simultaneously, she whispered instructions to passengers nearby: "Stay low, keep calm, follow me exactly." Her movements were carefully choreographed, designed to keep the hijacker distracted while subtly preparing the passengers for safety. She noticed that the overconfident hijacker, who had been showing off his control, began reacting to her actions. His attention was split between the passengers he wanted to intimidate and the flight attendant, who now seemed more alert and focused than before. He underestimated her because she appeared calm and ordinary, a tactic that worked to her advantage. She knew that the best way to gain control was to make the hijackers think she was nothing more than a regular crew member. Meanwhile, she was planning every possible step to take the initiative at the right moment. Her combat training allowed her to anticipate movements before they happened. She saw the nervous hijacker preparing to rush forward to assert control and calculated how she could intercept him without harm to the passengers. Her strategy was not to attack blindly but to create an environment where the hijackers' mistakes would give her the upper hand. Timing was everything. Every small distraction, every whispered instruction, and every shift in position was carefully orchestrated to bring the situation closer to the point where she could act decisively. As the tension in the cabin grew, she continued subtly communicating with the passengers. A quiet gesture, a nod, or a whispered instruction kept them calm and ready. They began following her guidance instinctively, trusting her even without knowing why. Her authority was not based on loud commands or intimidation but on quiet confidence and strategic control. Even in fear, passengers could sense her competence and followed her lead. The flight attendant also remained aware of the plane itself. She noticed the locations of emergency exits, the distance to the cockpit, and the positions of cabin equipment. Everything could be used if the situation escalated. Even ordinary items like a folded tray, a safety magazine, or a seatbelt could become tools if necessary. Her military mind transformed the familiar airplane environment into a tactical space, giving her options and preparing her for every eventuality. With all these preparations, she finally reached the point where she could begin her first decisive moves. The distractions had worked. The hijackers were divided, their focus weakened, and their overconfidence had begun to show. Passengers were calmer, and she knew where everyone was positioned. The stage was set. She had created the perfect combination of distraction, observation, and readiness to act. Every detail she had considered now came together, and she was ready to begin regaining control of the flight. In that tense moment, she became more than a flight attendant. She was the silent protector of the cabin, the strategist ready to neutralize the threat without endangering a single passenger. She had turned chaos into opportunity, fear into controlled action, and her years of military experience into a precise plan that could save lives. The moment of action was approaching, and she was fully prepared to strike with precision, courage, and skill. The moment had finally come. The flight attendant had spent minutes carefully observing, analyzing, and preparing, and now she could feel that the time to act was near. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with focus. Years of combat training had taught her how to stay calm under pressure, how to control her nerves when every second mattered. She knew that hesitation could cost lives, and now she was ready to make her move. The hijackers were still trying to intimidate passengers, but her distractions had worked. One of the men, overconfident and distracted by her calm presence, was now slightly off balance. Another, nervous and jittery, glanced around the cabin nervously, unsure of where to focus. She had predicted this moment, and it was exactly what she had been waiting for. She subtly shifted her position, keeping herself between the nearest hijacker and a group of frightened passengers, all while maintaining the appearance of a regular flight attendant performing routine duties. Suddenly, she moved with precision. Using a combination of speed, stealth, and technique, she disarmed the first hijacker. It was not a reckless attack. It was a calculated strike, executed in a split second. She grabbed his wrist, twisted it with precision, and knocked the weapon away without causing a loud commotion. The hijacker froze, stunned by the sudden movement, not realizing he had been outmaneuvered. Passengers gasped quietly, some unable to believe what had just happened, while others instinctively ducked lower in their seats, unsure if this was safe. As she subdued him, she maintained her calm demeanor, speaking in a controlled, firm tone. "Stay calm. No one needs to get hurt." Her voice carried authority without aggression, a combination that kept passengers reassured and hijackers off balance. She knew that controlling the reaction of both groups, the terrified passengers and the armed hijackers, was just as important as controlling the hijackers themselves. With the first hijacker neutralized, she turned her attention to the others. Using her combat skills, she moved strategically through the cabin, blocking lines of attack and forcing the hijackers to focus on her. She was precise, fast, and efficient, striking only when necessary, always aware of the passengers' positions. Her experience in the military had taught her how to move in confined spaces, how to use momentum, and how to subdue an enemy without unnecessary risk. The narrow aisles of the plane were no obstacle for her. In fact, they gave her opportunities to control the hijackers' movements and limit their options. The nervous hijacker made a sudden move toward the cockpit, but she anticipated it. She intercepted him quickly, using a combination of leverage and precise strikes to immobilize him. He struggled briefly, realizing he was no match for her skill, and then she restrained him, keeping him under control until she could secure the situation. Her movements were fluid, almost like a dance, but every motion had a purpose. She was protecting passengers, disarming threats, and maintaining control, all at the same time. Passengers began to realize that the flight attendant was extraordinary. Some whispered to each other, their fear mixing with awe. They had seen ordinary crew members in emergencies, but nothing like this. She was calm under pressure, precise in action, and in complete control of a situation that could easily have spiraled into disaster. Children peeked out from behind parents' shoulders, trying to understand what was happening, while adults watched silently, trusting that this woman knew exactly what to do. Even as she subdued the hijackers, she never lost situational awareness. She kept checking the positions of all passengers, ensuring no one was in immediate danger. She also noted the locations of the remaining hijackers' weapons, ready to act at a moment's notice. Her military training had taught her that even a small mistake could be fatal, and she was determined that nothing would go wrong. Her precision and attention to detail were as crucial as her strength and skill. The struggle continued for a tense few minutes, each action measured and deliberate. The flight attendant never hesitated or panicked. Every move was calculated. She used the hijackers' own aggression against them, redirecting their energy, controlling their motions, and neutralizing the threats one by one. By the time the last hijacker realized what was happening, she had already subdued two, disarmed them, and positioned herself strategically to prevent any further attacks. Her presence alone had become a controlling force in the cabin, a silent command that no one dared challenge. By the end of this intense sequence, she had not only disarmed the hijackers but had done so without any passengers being harmed. The plane remained under her control, and the threat was neutralized enough to allow her and the crew to regain further stability. Her combination of calm authority, strategic thinking, and lethal skill had turned a potentially catastrophic situation into one of managed safety. She had used her combat experience in the sky, not just on the battlefield, to save lives, proving that training, courage, and quick thinking could make the impossible possible. In those few critical minutes, the ordinary flight attendant revealed her true self, a decorated combat pilot with the ability to act decisively under extreme pressure. She had transformed from a seemingly ordinary crew member into a hero, silently protecting dozens of innocent lives and restoring order to the cabin. The passengers, though still frightened, now had hope. The hijackers, meanwhile, were shocked, bewildered by her speed, precision, and control. No one on board would ever forget how she had turned the tide when every second counted. The plane was still airborne, but the immediate danger had been neutralized. The flight attendant, calm and composed once again, began preparing for the next steps, securing the hijackers fully and coordinating with the pilot to ensure the rest of the flight would be safe. She had acted decisively, but she knew that vigilance was still necessary. Her heroism had begun, but the final victory would require careful planning and continued control. After the initial confrontation, the flight attendant knew that her work was far from over. The hijackers were stunned, disoriented by her sudden, precise actions, but they were still dangerous. She could not let them regain control, and she could not allow panic to spread among the passengers. Calmly, she began taking full control of the situation, making sure that everyone, passengers, crew, and hijackers alike, was positioned for safety. She moved through the cabin like a commander on a battlefield, her focus sharp, her every step deliberate. Her first priority was the hijackers who had already been subdued. Using ropes, seatbelts, and her knowledge of restraint techniques, she carefully secured them without causing injury. She ensured that none of them could reach a weapon or move freely. Every motion was precise. She had learned during her military training that improper restraint could turn a small threat into a deadly one. The passengers watched silently, some in awe, others still too afraid to move, as she neutralized the danger. Her movements were calm and methodical, demonstrating authority and control, while also keeping the fear levels in the cabin as low as possible. Once the immediate threat was restrained, she turned her attention to communication. She whispered to the crew, giving clear instructions on how to maintain calm among the passengers. She instructed them to keep everyone seated, reassure children, and avoid making sudden movements that might alarm the hijackers or the passengers. Her voice was firm but calm, carrying authority without aggression. The crew followed her lead instinctively, sensing that she was in charge and that following her guidance was the best way to ensure safety. The passengers began to realize, slowly, that they were no longer completely at the mercy of the hijackers. The flight attendants' actions had created a sense of order in the chaos. Families held each other tighter, some whispered prayers, and others began quietly thanking her, though they did not fully understand the depth of her skill. To them, she was a calm, confident presence who had saved lives through her courage. What they didn't know yet was that she was a highly trained combat pilot, someone who had faced enemies in far more dangerous situations and survived. She then turned her focus to the cockpit. The pilot had maintained control of the plane, but communication with the hijackers had been difficult, and the risk of panic affecting the flight stability was still high. The flight attendant coordinated with the pilot through subtle signals and whispered instructions, ensuring that the plane remained on course and that the hijackers could not regain access. Her situational awareness allowed her to anticipate potential risks, and she ensured that both the passengers and crew were safe while the aircraft remained stable. The hijackers, still bound and controlled, looked at her with shock and confusion. They had not expected resistance, and certainly not from someone who appeared to be just a flight attendant. Her presence had completely shifted the power dynamic. Their confidence had been replaced with fear and uncertainty, and they realized that they were no longer in control. She maintained a calm but watchful eye on them, aware that any sudden movements could still pose a risk. By projecting authority and confidence, she prevented them from attempting anything rash or dangerous. As she moved down the aisle, she continued giving quiet instructions to passengers. "Keep your seatbelt fastened, stay calm, we're safe now," she whispered, her voice steady and reassuring. Children clung to their parents, peeking cautiously, while adults nodded, trusting her guidance. Every instruction she gave was designed to maintain calm and prevent panic, which could have caused chaos in the confined space of the plane. Her ability to balance authority with reassurance was critical. She was not just controlling the hijackers. She was controlling the energy of the entire cabin. Next, she ensured that emergency protocols were in place. She checked that the doors were secure, that the restraints on the hijackers were tight, and that the crew knew exactly where to stand to prevent any potential risks. Every movement was deliberate. Nothing was left to chance. Her military training in high-risk operations allowed her to think several steps ahead, ensuring that the situation remained stable and that no sudden action could jeopardize the safety of the passengers or the plane. Throughout the cabin, passengers began to breathe a little easier. Fear was still present, but it was mixed with awe and gratitude. They began to realize that their survival had depended entirely on the quick thinking, courage, and skill of the flight attendant. Some tried to whisper thanks, while others simply sat silently, absorbing the calm authority that now filled the plane. She had transformed from a seemingly ordinary crew member into the guardian of everyone on board, someone who had stepped into a dangerous situation and turned it into a controlled environment. Finally, with the hijackers fully restrained, the passengers calm, and the crew following her guidance, she could focus on the next step, getting the plane safely to its destination. She coordinated with the pilot, who had been stabilizing the aircraft the entire time, and together they ensured that the flight remained on course. Her strategic thinking had turned a potentially catastrophic situation into one where every risk was managed. The cabin, once chaotic and terrifying, now reflected order, safety, and control. By the time the plane approached its destination, the flight attendant had fully regained control. She had neutralized the hijackers, protected the passengers, and ensured that the crew could operate effectively. Her skill, courage, and calm under pressure had turned a terrifying hijacking into a story of survival and heroism. The passengers had witnessed bravery in its purest form, though they were only beginning to realize the depth of her extraordinary abilities. Through her decisive actions, the flight attendant had transformed the ordinary commercial flight into a demonstration of courage, strategy, and leadership. She had not only saved lives but had done so with precision, skill, and composure. The hijackers were helpless, the passengers were safe, and the plane remained secure, all because of her quick thinking and extraordinary training. The plane touched down smoothly, but the tension in the cabin remained high. Passengers had survived a terrifying ordeal, yet many were still too shocked to fully comprehend what had just happened. Some clutched the hands of loved ones, others sat frozen in their seats, staring at the floor or the ceiling, trying to process the events that had unfolded. The hijackers, restrained and powerless, were quiet and defeated, their confidence shattered. All around, the crew and passengers looked to the flight attendant, the woman who had silently become their protector, their strategist, and their hero. As the plane taxied to the gate, the authorities and airport security teams were already preparing to board. The news that a hijacking had occurred spread quickly through the control tower, and officials were aware of the danger that had been contained. They moved with urgency but carefully, knowing the situation was delicate. Inside the cabin, the flight attendant remained composed, directing the crew on how to keep the passengers calm until the authorities arrived. Her tone was calm, confident, and commanding, yet gentle enough to reassure terrified travelers that the danger had passed. Passengers began to whisper to each other, realizing that their survival had depended not on luck, but on the courage and skill of one woman. Many stared at her with awe, slowly piecing together the realization that she had not just performed her duties as a flight attendant. She had taken control of a deadly situation, neutralized armed hijackers, and protected everyone on board, all while maintaining her composure and calm authority. Some of the passengers were too overwhelmed to speak, their emotions a mixture of relief, admiration, and gratitude. When the authorities finally boarded, they were shocked to find the hijackers already restrained and the passengers unharmed. Their questions turned immediately to the flight attendant, who had orchestrated the entire operation. Calmly, she explained how she had managed the situation, the assessments she had made, the distractions she had created, and the precise interventions she had executed. As she spoke, the authorities realized that she was no ordinary flight attendant. Her tactical knowledge, composure, and strategic planning indicated extensive military training. They asked her about her background, and she revealed, for the first time, that she was a decorated combat pilot with years of battlefield experience and confirmed kills in hostile territories. The revelation left everyone, passengers, crew, and authorities, stunned. The woman who had saved dozens of lives had a history few could imagine. She had trained for life-and-death scenarios, faced heavily armed enemies, and survived missions that required skill, courage, and quick thinking. Her kill marks, which documented confirmed enemy targets during her military service, were now no longer a secret. She had brought that same precision, calm, and expertise to the plane, turning a potential tragedy into a story of heroism. Passengers began to express their gratitude in quiet, heartfelt ways. Some clutched her hands, tears in their eyes, while others whispered words of thanks. Families with children hugged each other tightly, grateful that their loved ones had been kept safe. Even those who had been too scared to move during the hijacking now looked at her with admiration and respect. For many, it was hard to imagine that the calm, professional flight attendant who had guided them through the chaos was also a battle-hardened combat pilot capable of extraordinary skill under pressure. News of her bravery quickly spread. The story of the hijacking became front-page news, and soon the world would hear about the woman who had faced armed hijackers and saved an entire plane of passengers. Reporters described her as a hero, a guardian angel, and a reminder that courage could take many forms. Yet for her, the recognition was secondary. She remained humble, focused on the passengers and the crew, ensuring that everyone disembarked safely and that the authorities had everything they needed to handle the aftermath. As passengers left the plane, many turned back to give her a final look, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary actions she had taken. Some would never forget the fear they had felt, nor the relief they had experienced when the hijackers were neutralized. Others would tell friends and family about the calm, professional flight attendant who had become their hero, saving lives with a combination of intelligence, courage, and unmatched skill. Even as the immediate danger passed, she remained vigilant. Her military training had instilled the habit of staying alert until a situation was completely resolved. She guided the crew through debriefing the passengers, ensured that the authorities had all the information they needed, and coordinated the safe removal of the hijackers. Her composure never wavered. Her focus remained sharp. For the passengers, the ordeal had been terrifying, but it also became a story of hope, bravery, and inspiration. They had witnessed firsthand what it meant to have someone truly trained for extreme danger in their midst. The flight attendant had shown that courage was not just about strength or aggression, but about observation, strategy, calm under pressure, and the willingness to act decisively when it mattered most. She had saved dozens of lives not by sheer force, but by using her mind, her skills, and her courage in perfect harmony. As the passengers disembarked and the authorities took control of the hijackers, the flight attendant quietly stepped aside, returning to her role as a professional crew member. To anyone looking at her now, she might have seemed ordinary again. Calm, polite, and professional. But those who had been on the flight, the crew who had witnessed her actions, and the authorities who had debriefed her knew the truth. She was extraordinary, a true hero, a combat pilot who had brought her skills into a civilian world to save lives when no one else could. In the end, what had begun as an ordinary flight had turned into a story of courage, skill, and extraordinary heroism. The passengers survived, the hijackers were captured, and the flight attendant's secret history of bravery was revealed. She had acted decisively, calmly, and with precision, proving that even in the most frightening and chaotic situations, one person's courage could change everything. Her actions would be remembered not just as a moment of bravery, but as an example of what it means to protect others with skill, intelligence, and heart.